Thank you to Mr. Secretary General. Thank you, Moon. Thank you to the United Nations also for sharing with us your remarks. And thank you to the Institute of Politics for helping us to make this happen.
Next, it's our pleasure to introduce you to Marcela Escobar, who will welcome and facilitate this morning's keynotes. Marcela is Executive Director of Harvard Center for International Development. Before coming to Harvard in 2007, Marcela worked at the strategy consulting firm OTF Group, the World Bank, and JP Morgan. She's a Harvard Kennedy School alumna. Marcela has been a tremendous help in organizing this morning's session, so please join us in welcoming her.
It's an honor for me to introduce Martin Wolf and Dani Rodrik to join us. We are very lucky to have two of the most prominent thinkers in world affairs and economics to open up our conference today. So Martin Wolf is the world's premier financial journalist. He has worked with the Financial Times for the last 20 years now as the chief economics commentator. In 2004, he wrote Why Globalization Works, advocating for the role of corporations, markets, and trade in creating sustainable prosperity. Now, with the financial crisis, he also saw the perils of too much deregulation and free markets, and he recently wrote Fixing Global Finance. There is no leader or aspiring leader out there that does not have his breakfast without first having read his FT column. So many of you also know Dani Rodrik. He's a leading scholar in globalization and international development. And throughout his impressive career, Dani has usually opted to challenge the conventional wisdom on how growth and development happens. And he's been right enough times that when he speaks, the world tends to listen. And if there's one theme, an overarching theme in Dani's work, is that one size does not fit all. And that's the theme you've seen in both of his books, recent books, One Economics, Many Recipes, and The Globalization Paradox. Now, there are many things that these two people agree on or are similar in. They're two very deep thinkers, data-driven, who are very wary of oversimplification. And while at the same time taking some of the most complex issues in our world economy and making it very accessible. And this approach is just extremely refreshing, more so these days with election politics and very simplified, ideological discourse. There are also two people who really care about bringing prosperity to the world's poor. Now, we are hoping that for this session, they will focus on their differences for both learning and entertainment value. So we have created a format. Well, I'll start with a very softball question, and then open it to each other to ask each other questions for the next half hour before we open it up to all of you. So to get started, Mr. Wolf, you've written the most compelling book about the merits of globalization. And Dani, you've been a little more tepid in your enthusiasm about the merits and challenges of global integration. So I'd love for you to start by giving us 2-3 minutes on the premise of your book and maybe finding the most poignant example out there in the world that you think makes your case for globalization, particularly from the perspective of developing countries. And we could start with Martin Wolf.
First of all, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. The last time I was here, it's about 8 years ago, I think, I gave a lecture on my second book, which was about global imbalances and the extreme stresses the US was coming under. So I remember that very well. The second reason that I always love coming to Harvard is that, unlike many of you, I was rejected by Harvard. And I love telling them that. That's a story. Now, in terms of the reason, by the way, unbelievable, at the time of the Vietnam War, and strangely enough, every single American wanted to go to graduate school. I can't even imagine why. Now, on the book, the premise of the book, the premise of the book was what it was. It was written in the context, which is very interesting. It's the first point I made, which is about Western fads and fancies, not about development at all. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a very, very vigorous, and I thought pretty ill-informed and ill-considered anti-globalization movement, and which focused predominantly on trade and foreign investment. That was the focal things that they thought were foreign direct investment, that people thought were unbelievably wicked. And I thought this was completely wrong-headed, and the bulk of the book was really about that. And strangely enough, now that in my view there's a perfectly reasonable, sensible cause for saying that globalization has gone too far, namely the financial crisis and what all that means, the globalization protest movement has disappeared. What's wrong with you people? Now is the time, surely, when it actually makes sense. But I came to the conclusion in my childhood, as it were, in the 60s, that these Western protest movements among students predominantly have no relationship whatsoever to the actual objective issues out there in the world. They have something to do with what's going on in our own societies. That's the first point. So the second point I make is that, yes, on those two fundamental issues, integration in the world economy and foreign direct investment, I talk a great deal about trade, and investments are the biggest part. I remain fundamentally where I was. The nature of the opportunities turned out to be rather different from what I thought. One of the things I hadn't even envisaged when I wrote this, which was in the early 2000s, what an extraordinary range of opportunities and challenges the rise of China itself would create for development. I didn't imagine that it would be the principal motor of world trade, and the extraordinary challenges and opportunities that would create for countries around the world in Latin America. A world now in which Brazil trades much more with China than it does with the US. That's an extraordinary extension of my thesis. But the basic logic, I think, holds. And obviously, then now, I thought the story of China was an extraordinary example, to come to you, of the basic logic of my position. Now, I'm sure Dani will now come to the issues, so I'm going to leave him to do that, since I certainly have my 3 minutes. The issues where I would change my mind. But that was the core theme of the book, and I think it's now pretty widely accepted. We can debate some of the margins on that central theme of the book. In fact, I sometimes joke the only people in the world who seem now still to believe in trade and foreign direct investment are the people who run developing countries.
Well, the first thing I'd like to make clear is that the admissions officer who rejected Martin Wolf has long been fired. He's working at some community college somewhere. The second thing is that it's fair to say that I think we disagree a lot less with Martin today than we probably would about 10 years ago. But following Marcela's instructions, we'll try to maybe accentuate our differences. But to respond to the question that Marcela posed, I think the issues around globalization and development are often miscast. It's sort of viewed as a question of, are you pro-globalization, are you against globalization? Is globalization good for development? Is globalization bad for development? I think this is a question that gets us nowhere. I think, and I don't want to put words on Martin's mouth, but I would say that we would both agree that what matters is the manner in which countries integrate themselves into the world economy and how they utilize the opportunities and the leverage that the world economy provides to lift themselves both in aggregate and in terms of the worst off of their population out of poverty and generate economic opportunity. Now, we have experienced a huge range of diverse outcomes here. One of the paradoxes of globalization, if you look at, let's say, the period since sort of the most advanced stage of globalization that we've experienced since the early 1990s, it's been a period where countries have moved at a very heterogeneous pace with very heterogeneously diverse kind of outcomes. Obviously globalization is just one thing. It's just, you have the availability of global markets, global technology, global pools of money that's sort of waiting to move around. And the outcomes are different around the world. So that already tells you that what you do as a nation, what the political leadership does, how you run your own affairs, is the primary determinant of whether you're going to be taking advantage of the opportunities that globalization offers. Clearly, as Martin mentioned, China has been the country that has been the most successful in terms of taking advantage of globalization and markets. I think it's important to underscore that. Since China started its reforms, in China, something like 650 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. In fact, this is essentially the same number as the world as a whole, which is, if you look at the reduction in the number of the absolute poor people below the dollar a day poverty line around the world, all the gains in global poverty reduction essentially come from China. The rest of the world is a wash. Some countries have done better, some countries have done worse. And clearly, China would not have done as well if it hadn't taken advantage of markets and globalization, but it has done so by marching to its own drum, by marching to its own set of policies. I like the analogy that a Chinese student once said, which is that China's approach to globalization is the following, that you open your window, but you do not forget to put a screen to keep the mosquitoes out. So with the open window, you get the fresh air, but the screen keeps the bugs out. And it's exactly the approach that China has followed by ensuring that it creates its own capabilities through concerted state action. It diversifies its economies. It's only with this kind of economic restructuring that you can actually leverage the power of the globalization. So it's this mixed strategy that really works, and I think that's the kind of global environment that's going to empower developing countries, is the environment that actually allows countries to follow these mixed strategies rather than trying to shoehorn them into just cookie-cutter strategies.
So we perhaps we should move on, so we're going to have a dialogue. I'll just make one comment on this, which is an interesting one, because I discussed it in my book subsequently, which is about how we think about these numbers. Dani's numbers are completely correct, of course. The world's population, as was pointed out at the beginning, is growing quite rapidly. And it's, of course, growing most rapidly in the poorest countries. That makes the problem of eliminating poverty over time very difficult, because inevitably you find yourselves having to deal with the countries which have found it most difficult to develop. And that's where the number of poor people is rising. In the case of India, which is an interesting intermediate case, and where, in fact, the largest number of poor people in the world, very poor people live in India, the proportions are falling. The proportions of very poor people are falling, but the population is growing sufficiently rapidly that the numbers aren't. At least on the statistics, the World Bank statistics as I read them. The Indian own statistics seem a bit more difficult to interpret. So one of the things to think about is that you can succeed proportionately but not absolutely, and that determines in very important ways the location of the future challenges and the nature of the future challenges. I think it's important, and I just want to make one other point about the China thing, because I'd like Dani's comment on this. China's become a new pole of growth for the world. In fact, it's becoming, I think, slowly a new core for the world economy. One of the consequences of its rise is that clearly that it is transforming world commodity markets in a very profound way. And it has therefore created a very powerful set of new trade opportunities for countries which have commodities to sell. But of course, many people around the world, and it's something I've been thinking about, it wouldn't change basically what I feel, but it's changed the opportunities in an important way. One of the things it's done is, as it were, threaten, quote unquote, deindustrialization for many countries that now find, Brazil is an obvious example, that now find the opportunity to sell commodities overwhelms all other opportunities. It appreciates the real exchange rates, what we used to call the Dutch disease. So how do you feel about the impact of China on the world economy in terms of the opportunities it creates for the trade strategy, broadly speaking, for other developing countries? Where are the pluses and minuses here, and how would you manage them?
Yeah, great question, and I think that China's growth and its huge and growing appetite for commodities and resources has created a severe dilemma for developing countries, and I think Brazil, in some sense, exemplifies this dilemma precisely. The dilemma, as you said, is that on the one hand, because as commodity prices boom, many developing countries that have minerals to export, natural resources to export, can take advantage of that. And in fact, a good deal of Latin America's as well as Sub-Saharan Africa's growth in the last decade or so has been driven by relatively high commodity prices, in turn driven by China's demand. Now, that's a good thing. On the other hand, our historical experience with commodity-led growth, with natural resources specialization, is not a very good one. In fact, the very first era of globalization in the 19th century, we saw the world for the first time get divided into a core, an industrial core, and a natural resource exporting periphery. Now, some of the countries of the periphery, which were developing rapidly early on because of their ability to export primary products to the industrialized core, did well for some time. And maybe the most important example is Argentina. Argentina grew into one of the world's most richest countries, wealthiest countries in the 19th century off the back of its produce in the pampas. But the experience of countries like Argentina and many other countries earlier shows us that this kind of specialization on commodities, on natural resources, is a stunted kind of growth for a couple of reasons. Economically, the problem is that often these natural resources do not generate sufficient employment for your low-skilled or semi-skilled people. It doesn't generate enough employment opportunities for the people that you want to get off the farm, off traditional agriculture, subsistence agriculture. So it comes with a lot of inequalities, it comes with inadequacies for promoting employment. The second deeper political reason that it generates a kind of stunted political in many countries that haven't already democratized. It generates a stunted form of institutional development. It empowers a sort of narrow elite who live off of the rents generated by these natural resource sectors. This may be less of a problem for Brazil because Brazil, I think, has a healthy democracy, but it's certainly a problem for many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that haven't yet consolidated their democracies. So I see this as a very mixed opportunity, and I think what Brazil is doing right now to counter, sort of in some sense to offset some of these tendencies by following certain kinds of industrial policies that are going to be generating greater domestic linkages in generating manufacturing industry, industrial jobs, I think is the right thing to do, although I think with instruments in hand, there's only limited that they're going to be able to achieve. Let me turn the question back to Martin now. As you mentioned, Martin, India is actually the world, is this country where the largest concentration of poor people in the world are. When we think of poverty, we often think of Africa because there's so many countries there. The incidence of poverty is so high. But India is really where, in terms of a sheer number of paupers, where the poor people are. China and the broader East Asia actually contains more absolute poor people than Africa. What is your prognosis as to sort of how, on the one hand, India, and on the other hand, China are likely to develop in the decade ahead and be able to? What are their respective advantages and disadvantages in this challenge?
I think that's a wonderful question. And my normal answer to this is I never forecast, especially the future. There are so many things that have happened in my lifetime have been surprises that I've developed a pretty healthy sort of skepticism about one's ability to analyze that. And I give you a very long list. When I started looking at development very carefully in the late 60s and early 70s, actually the fastest growing significant developing country at that time was Brazil. And people talked about the Brazilian miracle. It grew for about 10%. It's about 10% a year for about a decade, if I remember correctly, prior to 74. And then, of course, it hit a crisis which it didn't really overcome until the early part of the last decade. So there was almost 25 lost years. So forecasting this is really, really troublesome. My broad answer, though, would go something like this. First of all, it seems to me, and it follows from what we said, that the pattern of development that seems to have worked best for generating sustained rises in prosperity, which are reasonably widely shared, we can discuss the details of that, has been sort of export-oriented to some degree, industrialization of a fairly labor-intensive kind. That's at least the industrialization process, the sort of classic industrialization process. And in the post-Second World War period, there's no doubt at all that the countries that have been most successful with this strategy have been the East Asian countries. Japan was really the forerunner of this. Then there was Korea, Taiwan. These were examples that influenced the whole development profession very profoundly. When I worked in the World Bank in the 70s, these models seemed very relevant. And very broadly speaking, given the difference in scale, China's followed the same sort of pattern. Of course, because China is so vast, it takes longer to affect the entire population, so there are still lots of poor people, and of course a lot of the shifting of the export and the industrialization pattern occurs within China, again, because it's so big. So, because this has been so, that's the first point, because this pattern has been so successful, it has worked to get countries, or a country like Korea has moved from being really an immensely poor country, much poorer than most African countries at that time. In the 50s, widely forgotten, Korea was much poorer than most African countries in the 1950s, to being a developed country in 2 generations. It's a phenomenal story. And I followed this. I went to Korea first in the early 70s, 72. So I've seen this happen. So from that point of view, I would say China is on a path that has proved to work. The scale is different. The problems of managing this are different because of the scale. But it looks like the sort of thing that you'd expect to continue with shocks along the way. And of course, China has a relatively authoritarian political structure, so people get worried about democratization and what will happen to that. But actually, though it's different, everything is different. The same is true for Korea and Taiwan when they started and they did make this transition. So the optimistic view would be basically China's going to make it, and actually basically I believe that. So I do basically believe that. Though I can perfectly well see things. I can certainly tell stories about things going wrong. India's a very different path, and politically, of course, it's a democracy, a very chaotic one. But India's development is very peculiar in some ways relative to this standard model. It's been built on services. Services have grown as fast as industry. A lot of these services are services which are really quite human capital intensive, which is quite surprising. It's not where you'd expect a developing country to start. There's been very slow industrialization. The growth of the industrial labor force has essentially been close to zero. Urbanization has been relatively slow as well. And I think that is the main reason, along with the failures of education, failures of, to generate a more broadly shared development process. And also the growth rate on a per capita basis has been half as fast as China's. And I still tend to the view, so to answer your question, that I think that if India is going to change that pattern, it's going to have to become a little more like China. It's going to have to be able to make industrialization work for it as well, generate a lot of jobs for it, above all, relatively good jobs through industrialization, and that will, I can't see it becoming a wealthy, prosperous, developed country with what is still an enormous rural population, and it's still about half the population, if I remember correctly, well over half, and of the labour force. But at the same time, the politics are more responsive in some obvious way, and maybe that will be a big help. But I suppose if I were going to be really bold about it, and I know many of my Indian friends think this is utterly wrong, I think that India has more to learn economically from China than the other way around. And how the politics fits into that, I don't really know.
I guess...
Because one thing I have learnt about the politics in development is nobody knows. Nobody knows. The world is just nothing but surprises as far as how politics interact with development.
I want to put a little bit more emphasis on the differences in the political regimes, because it seems to me that for all of its inefficiency and problems, India has a significant virtue, a significant advantage going for itself, which is that it's a political democracy. And China still faces that transition, that huge challenge of making that political transition to a more political regime. And how China will handle that, I think, to me, beyond the economic rebalancing issues, is one of the biggest question marks. On the other hand, I echo Martin. I remember, I think it's John Kenneth Galbraith who said that God created the economic forecasters to make astrologers look good. So we don't want to say too much about the future.
I will ask you a question now. So no, it's actually very, we must get to finance in a while, but I think one of the most important contributions you've made is to stress the role of, from developing economics, of political institutions and the normative value of democracy. And surprisingly, I agree with you completely on the normative value of democracy. Not very surprising, perhaps. But wouldn't you have to accept that, while it's a very clearly democracy, we would agree, surely, is a good in itself, an immense good in many different ways, its connections with development are really pretty obscure. And you can't really say in a simple way, well, if only you have elections, political parties, so development will go okay. And if you have a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime, it will necessarily go badly wrong. Just isn't true. So how do you connect your political normative views with your analysis as a profound student of economic development?
I think if one were to look for a simple correlation between the nature of the political regime and how well you do in terms of aggregate economic growth, I think one wouldn't find a correlation. Because we have had countries that have been authoritarian regimes that have done very well. We've had authoritarian regimes that have done very poorly. However, one of the interesting empirical regularities is that living in an authoritarian regime is much more of a crapshoot than living in a democracy. So, if you happen to pick a dictator like President Park in the early 60s, you're going to develop very rapidly. On the other hand, you can pick a dictator like President Mobutu, and he's going to drive your economy to ruin. Now, the virtue of democracy is basically that maybe the extremes on the positive end are less attainable, but certainly the extremes on the worst end are also become much less likely. So that the overall pattern is that democracies tend to sort of produce more stable or more predictable outcomes. And of course, India is a very good example of that. Never really very stellar, but has avoided deep crises, has been actually surprisingly been able to turn around quite quickly from balance of payments problems. The second advantage, so one advantage of democracy is actually that, that stability and predictability, and this I'm not even talking about inherent normative benefits of being able to elect your own leaders. The second, of course, is that on pretty much every distributive dimension, that democracies tend to do better. So they tend to pay their workers better, they tend to deal with poverty issues better, they tend to provide more education, more public goods. So once we start looking at development more broadly than just economic growth, I think there's, even from a narrow economic standpoint, democracies have a lot to say for themselves. Let me check.
Can I just make one comment because it's relevant to China? The Chinese, and I don't think we need to go further, would say that the really big problem, they have experience of it, so they know what they're talking about. The really big problem with despotism is if you're vulnerable to the whim of the despot. But we have institutionalized the Communist Party state. That has diffused the possibility, or almost eliminated the possibility of having the whim of being at the mercy of the whim of the despot. And so what you end up with is the very best of of rule by a wise, far-seeing bureaucracy of properly educated people, many of whom have probably been here. Isn't that actually the best of both worlds?
Well, again, if you can pick your Platonic ruler, there's no question that that's the best. The reason we go for democracy is because we do not trust. We don't want to sort of empower anybody to make decisions for us, given that their interests might be different or they might make the wrong decisions.
You want questions from the audience here?
Yes, just when it's getting interesting.
Well, we're enjoying this.
Nobody's going to ask me what I've changed my mind most about since I've read my book on verbalization.
Well,
I'm happy to deal with that question if anybody should ask.
He's ready.
It's been asked. Tell us.
Well, I think this is a very interesting question. Because one of the consequences, if any of you should ever end up doing my sort of job, you will find an ineradicable electronic trail of all the things that you got wrong, and very public. And unless you're an extremely boring individual, there will be a lot of them. There will be a lot of them. So clearly that is true in this case. I think that the most obvious question, but it's actually, I think, not the biggest vulnerability, is about finance. The chapter of finance is clearly the one that is most skeptical. It had quite a long discussion of the Asian financial crisis and the lessons of the Asian financial crisis. I did argue that ultimately developing countries should integrate themselves in the financial system, but I described the risks of that, I think, reasonably well, and I have never been, at any stage, I think, could be described in the camp of the gung-ho financial liberalizers. What I would say is that I would probably be even more skeptical now than I was then, given what has happened since then. But I think, if I just focus on the financial side, the dilemmas for developing countries that are, to some degree, part of the world economy, I think we all agree, probably, that isolation isn't really a positive strategy. You are going to be part of the world economy, of managing the interface with the global monetary and financial systems, which was part of my second book, The Fixed Global Finance. These dilemmas are very profound, and there simply aren't, in my view, simple and neat solutions. Extreme point solutions have been, for example, to come back to China, China's foreign currency manipulation of that intervention with the capital controls regime. That has, I think, cushioned them to some considerable degree from problems, given them a lot of freedom, but it actually has also created some very big dilemmas, and it certainly has led to some extraordinary waste of resources in the simply staggering investment in the US liabilities on which they're going to lose a lot of money. But I think the crucial point is I was always skeptical. I'd be more skeptical now than I was. But I think we should focus on the various alternative ways different developing countries with different structures have to manage their interface with the global financial and monetary system. It's really, really a difficult thing to do. Just one other very quick point. The thing that I actually do think I underplayed most seriously was the environment, and much more serious than finance. And if I wrote that, because at that stage I hadn't really done the reading and work on the climate change issues and other cross-border environmental questions, and including straightforward cross-border water supply questions. And those sections of the book would have been very different. Unfortunately, the book was already 420 pages. It was 60,000 words longer than the publisher asked for, and if I'd added another 20,000 words on environment, they wouldn't have published it, so it would have been a problem.
Good, so let's open it up for questions. If people can line up on the microphones. And until you guys get the courage, let me ask one question. Which is, we rarely would have an audience so concentrated with people who really want to have an impact in development. And as you think about all these challenges that are posed by this conference of the 7 billion, overpopulation, climate change, depletion of resources, I'd pose a couple questions. One, do you have any reason not to be depressed that you'd like to share with us? And second, if there's any advice about focus, you understand these complex issues. If you think about people who are going to destine their careers in this topic, what are some issues that you think we should be focusing on? If you could give us a couple minutes.
I'm happy to give an answer to the first part. I think in this area, there's really no reason to be depressed. I started working on development in the 70s. And I would say that if I look at the picture in the world as a whole, that what strikes me as how much has changed for the better. Now, not much, perhaps as much as we might have hoped for, and there are problems we certainly didn't foresee. Many, 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 innumerable. But the success has been so large that the whole balance of power of the world is being changed. At that stage, when I started working, and these are the two countries I follow most closely, and they are the big ones, India was growing at 3% a year. That seemed to be the most it could do. This was 1% GDP per head, well, 0.5%. It was basically stagnant. Nothing was happening. And China was in the Cultural Revolution. It was somewhere else altogether. And the contrast between that and these countries now is just completely different. And East Asia and Southeast Asia as a whole have done remarkable things. And that's half of the world's population. I mean, that is half the world's population. I did work on Africa. That has had, of course, a terrible 80s and 90s. Though, again, there's no doubt on my reading of the statistics, despite and I haven't visited Africa in the same way recently, in that in the last 10 years, it seems to me at least things are definitely getting better. And I think the same has been true for South America. So I think development is one of the few great causes of the last half century, 60, 70 years, where you could say at least the direction is unambiguously positive. Very difficult, many terrible challenges, but I think the world has improved far more than I really believe was likely 30 years ago.
I would largely echo that. I mean, I think there's one huge environmental challenge that we face, the climate change issue, which is really, it's really decisive how we're going to be addressing that. And there's no other way to address that than just by getting our collective heads bang together and figuring out how to deal with that issue. It's obviously going to affect everybody. But if you look at issues of sort of local environmental challenges, issues of sort of overpopulation and so forth, I think many of those local problems in African countries and so forth are largely going to be solved by development. Development actually is the answer to those things. In my book, I talk about the case of Mauritius. Mauritius is very interesting because it was a full basket case in the early 60s. So much that the British government, worried about what was going to happen, sent a very high-powered economics team to figure out, what to do about the overpopulation problem and the sort of declining arable land and so forth. And the team that was led by the Nobel Prize-winning economist James Sneed came back totally depressed and said, it's really nothing population was supposed to grow at more than 3%, and we were running out of arable land. Mauritius today is a middle-income country that has income level of Southern Europe, and how they've done it is by basically diversifying their economies, getting people from the monocrop economy that they had based on sugar, which had put a lot of demand on scarce resources, getting them out of that kind of production to textiles, clothing, simple manufacturers, and that's how they did it. So diversification, structural change, development was the answer to the population pressure, and I think that can be replicated elsewhere with the right policies.
Thank you.
That was my first mission to the World Bank was to Mauritius, so I take completely. No, I don't. but there was actually somebody on our mission, a very little known UNIDO specialist, who was directly responsible for setting up with the American help the first industrial processing zone, who started this off, and the success of that was to those engaged in it simply unimaginable. It's a smallish country, but it's very famous. The meat report is incredibly famous. And James Mead was a wonderful economist in every possible way, and it's one of the best examples of a really bad forecast was that Mauritius could not possibly develop.
Great.
Hello, thanks. My name is Ilya Lazowski. I'm a master's student from the Fletcher School up the street. Thanks for a very interesting discussion on globalization, and I'd be very curious for your thoughts about a little bit of a different side of globalization, and that's the spread of ideas and values, which I think have very much strengthened norms around the world relating to the value of liberal democracy and even more so human rights. And just as one concrete example of that, I think the actions that the Arab League has taken this year and the language that the Arab League has used regarding Libya and Syria and other situations has shown that the legitimacy of Arab states has very much connected now with the way that they treat their citizens, and I think that's a development which would have been very difficult to predict even just 5-10 years ago. So that seems to me an unambiguously positive side of globalization. I wonder if I could get your comment on that. Thanks very much.
It'd be great if only one of you called the questions so we can get a couple more.
I agree. I think Amartya Sen, who teaches here, would say this is the universalization of universal human values. And I think that's right. And it is one of the most positive things, broadly speaking. You can see it everywhere. You can see it you see it very clearly in China. And there are ways that you can't get away with, I think, the ways of treating people that are simply not legitimate anymore. That's a pretty profound change when I think of the world that I was born into in 46. This is a different world, and that's a very positive one.
Let me add just a quick portion because I think it's important. I agree both with the question and what Martin said. I just want to insert a little caution here in terms of where we're going. Because the universalizing of those values basically came from the practices of Western advanced democracies and was the result of the perception of the success of those democracies. I think one thing that is actually happening today is there's a very different narrative that's developing, which is actually the failure of democracy in the advanced countries. And I think you can see more and more in the Middle East, elsewhere, an alternative narrative that says this sort of liberal democracy and those values associated with that are actually not the way to go forward. That there are alternative modes that put less emphasis on liberal humane values, liberal democracy. And I do see going forward that this is going to be an issue as the performance of Western democracies looks worse and worse.
Hi, good morning. My name is Lauren Salazar. I'm at the LBJ School down in Austin. I flew up here. Thank you very much for your comments so far. My question is regarding the environment and a little bit about human rights. So I feel that lending organizations such as the World Bank and the IFC have a responsibility to doing more intense requirements for the recipients of their loans to evaluate the social and environmental impacts, and specifically thinking of projects like the Fulbari mine and border of Bangladesh and India, and other projects like what Brazil is doing in the Amazon, building dams. They're displacing a lot of communities. The environmental impacts I don't feel are appropriately evaluated and taken into consideration. How do you feel about these organizations that are supposedly working in the name of development that don't seem to be holding their recipients accountable, or as accountable as I think they could be?
Having worked at this is a very difficult one, and two ways. First, Brazil can get its money from many places. And the number of them, in fact, one of the most important changes of the last 40 years is the number of different places developing countries, emerging countries, get their money from. When I worked at the World Bank, it was pretty close to being a monopolist. It gave it a lot of leverage. Mostly what we asked to do was wrong, so this was not a help. But the power of these institutions has been enormously reduced. And on the whole, I think that's a good thing. It's because the world is developed that the people have a choices. That's very, very important. And the second point is a sort of sense that I felt it very strongly when I was there. There's a limit to how much any of these institutions should push governments, countries around. Now, of course, you can then get into the question, it's a very profound question. You've got a political process. Brazil's a democracy, right? Okay, not perfect. That has certain ways of managing internal political decision-making, which may well lead to terrible results, because particular communities are underrepresented and so forth. There's an absolutely fundamental question about whether international organizations, who elected them, right, should be allowed to go along and tell the government, you're not allowed to do this because you're mistreating your citizens. At the very least, it creates some very, very profound political and moral dilemmas. So in these two respects, I have a lot of sympathy with what you say. I'm not going to get into specific cases. But actually, this is really a difficult one. And I ended up with the view, when I left, which is part of the reason why I left, is that I just wasn't very happy with this sort of paternalism. And in any case, it's increasingly ineffective. If you don't want to finance something in most countries now, they can find lots of other people who will.
Good morning. Thank you for your view. I am taking the Master in International Cooperation in Madrid, and my question is related with, we are asking Brazil to be in the field with the democracy, and what we can expect from China instead of not the outcomes, the incomes, the population inside who are asking for fresh air, and what you expect very soon related with democracy inside China.
Dani, democracy in China, future of?
Well,
I'm going to give you the simple question.
Well, you know, I'm torn on this question because on the one hand, I do think that that there's a very significant political and economic bottleneck that awaits China is precisely how to transform its national political regime into one that's more open, more accountable, and more democratic. Now, as you know, at the local level, actually, there has been a lot of progress. And also at the national level, one of the characteristics of national political decision-making in China has always been a kind of gradualism and at the margin kind of reform that in some ways simulates the way that democracy works, which is in a democracy you don't step on important interest groups' toes because you need to have enough of a consensus. Even though the Chinese model is not a democratic model, the way that they have moved around is always to change and to reform the system in ways that doesn't impose large costs on significant amount of people. So in a way that actually generates more or less gains for everybody. But I think they've reached the limits of that model. And I think with every successive the amount of social strife that is under the surface in China, the revolts, the peasant revolts over land issues, the complaints, I think that's just astounding. It is a fundamental challenge that they face, which is one reason why I'm actually less optimistic than Martin about the China's economic prospects going forward. Now, to their credit, the Chinese have always been very good at identifying and removing whatever bottleneck they faced at every point along the way of their development during the last 30 years. But this is a huge one, the political transformation, how to deal with the role of the political monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party. That's a huge one, and I think it's how they're going to do it, I just don't know. All I can say, I think it's a huge challenge, and they'll have to do it if they want to go past the middle income status.
Okay, so before we end, can I just ask you one sentence each about the latest soap opera in development, which only us follow, which is the World Bank's presidency? Can you one sentence for us to leave on an intriguing note?
Maybe it's two sentences in my case. I have argued now for a very, very long time, that the carve-up which gave the World Bank to the US and the IMF to Europe is way, way past its sell-by date. So clearly a genuinely open process in which the candidates are going to be selected on their merits and not on the basis of this carve-up, which is itself a reflection of an outmoded vote-weighting system, is overdue. So that's point one. Point two, my own view pretty strongly, but it does rest on my view of what the future of the bank is, as well as more fundamental symbolic aspect, is that the best candidate is Ngozi. But then that may be partly because I know her quite well, and I find her a very remarkable and refreshing human being. I don't know the other two, and I certainly don't know Dr. King. So that may be unfair, but for these two reasons, I would be very, very happy if Ngozi, as a very experienced professional, as an African, as a woman, were to be selected. I don't unfortunately expect it to happen.
Let me make 2 points as well. The first point is to say that I think there's one bad argument as to why Dr. Kim should not be appointed, and there's one good argument. The bad argument as to why he shouldn't be appointed is that he's not an economist. I think that's a silly argument, which is used a lot. The good argument is to echo
some of your colleagues, I think.
Well, we value diversity of opinion here. The good argument, to echo what Martin said, is that I think it's terrible practice to assume that whoever the Americans choose would get to be president. My second point would be that what's interesting in this choice between Ngozi on the one hand and Kim on the other, given that the third candidate, Oncampo, has now withdrawn, is that they actually represent quite distinct, interesting takes on development. One that is much more focused on the delivery of health and other social services at the ground level, the micro level, the other much more focused on economy-wide issues of macroeconomic management and so forth. So I would love it. I would love it if we can get the two of them to sit here and debate the respective merits of those two views, put their case forward as to why they ought to be president, that it would be a globally televised debate, and that there would be a selection afterwards on the basis of the merits of their views and rather than American politics.
Well, please join me in thanking
Thank you, Mr. Wolf and Professor Rodrik. It's a privilege to have you join us here today. And it's great also to start off, I think, the day with such a global macro perspective before looking more closely at the specific issues that we'll be dealing with in the panels. And I think you've also just given us, Professor Rodrik, ideas for next year's keynote speakers. So thank you. And Marcela, thank you so much for the wonderful questions and the thoughts. So before breaking to the next activities, we wanted to make a few brief announcements. You will notice that our 12 panels are organized into 4 simultaneous tracks today. The tracks are here really to help you visualize the menu of options. And you should definitely feel free to attend panels from different tracks. Don't feel limited. Panels, lunches, and workshops will be held in lecture halls throughout the Kennedy School. Most logistical details, including room locations and a map of the Kennedy School, can be found in the conference program, which you should hopefully have all picked up. Current information on activities and locations can also be found on TV screens located throughout the buildings, as you can see. Please note that there's an insert in your folders where you'll find a schedule update and information on a newly added workshop. If you have questions during the day, please feel free to approach any of the staff members who have green badges, so look out for those.
Next, we'd like to acknowledge the support of several organizations that made this conference possible. Most especially our 2 gold sponsors, Chevron and Green Gold, and our media sponsor, DevX, in addition to several Harvard centers and Carnegie Mellon University, which make up the bronze category. A special thanks to the Center for International Development as well, who has supported us in our organizing process and has several participants in today's activities. Finally, we'd like to thank all of you once again for being here. Our team has worked hard over the past 6 months to make this experience meaningful and enjoyable for all of you. Our hope is that through the conversations and activities today, we can take collective steps forward to a more equitable, healthy, and sustainable world for us and the 7 billion people who live here. Thank you, and enjoy the day.